Welcome to the Lott Carey Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving podcast. I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Madison McQuarrie, pastor of the First Baptist Church of New Market in Piscataway, New Jersey, and learning coordinator for Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving. The Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving weekly podcast grows from a multi-year journey among pastors committed to flourishing in ministry. This is a project of the Lott Carey Foreign Mission Society and is made possible through the generous support from the Lilly Endowment. Learn more about Lott Carey and how it helps churches to extend the Christian witness throughout the world at lottcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. Join us for weekly conversations with pastoral thought leaders who share wisdom from the Black church for the whole church. Let's join Reverend Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, Associate Dean for Vocational Formation and Christian Witness at Duke Divinity School, and the Project Director for Lott Carey's Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving. This week, he's in conversation with Reverend Gregory J. Jackson, Pastor Emeritus of the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Hackensack, New Jersey.
We rejoice to be in conversation today with Reverend Gregory Jackson. He's the Pastor Emeritus of the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Hackensack, New Jersey, and he is the president of the Lott Carey Foreign Mission Society, which is the sponsoring agency for our pilgrimages of striving and thriving. Welcome, Pastor Jackson, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
As you know, we've been on a journey for a few years with just over 50 pastors. About half are women pastors and about half are millennial and zennial pastors. And we've been on a pilgrimage toward flourishing in ministry. Our assumptions are that every round does not go higher and higher, and that like a tree, flourishing in ministry means sometimes there are leaves on the branches, sometimes there are blossoms. At other times, leaves may be falling away. And sometimes there are only bare branches, but the tree can still be healthy and flourishing and thriving. What does flourishing in ministry look like to you?
Well, thank you for that question. Flourishing looks different at different times to me, I suppose, given the analogy that you've given in terms of leaves and blooming, etc. And I guess a tree can look dead and still be flourishing, as you mentioned, and I think that's all about how it is rooted. And I think that in ministry, things don't always look like they're thriving. I think most of us know what it is like to strive towards flourishing. But if we spend some time digging a little deeper and not being over concerned with numbers, even though we are concerned with numbers, and spending time getting anchored, if you will, to use the old spiritual song, being anchored in the Lord, that leaves can return, blooms can return, and really flourishing is somewhat cyclical, I guess. You never, at least my experience has been, you never flourish all the time. You I don't want to say you die to live again, but you certainly regress. And in that regressing, I think it helps us to really get deeper in our roots and to recognize that flourishing is not just mental, but it is certainly spiritual as well. So that would be my, kind of preliminary conversation of what flourishing would mean. And in the world that we live in, flourishing looks like buildings, it looks like numbers, it looks like money. And that may be a part of it, but it's far more than that. It's about relationships, it's about transformation, it's about people's lives being changed and rerouted, in the words of, I remember as a boy, my grandmother would make me go out and get a bigger pot sometimes to replant a plant because that plant had outgrown that pot. And sometimes our lives need to be rerouted as well.
Well, one of the things that in our pilgrimages of striving and thriving that we've been inviting pastors to consider is what we call a formula for flourishing. And that formula holds that if a pastor's leadership capacity plus service context yields the ministry content, there is a higher probability for flourishing. So we don't assume that you can just drag and drop a ministry model from somewhere else that's been developed with another set, but it's much more organic. Can you talk with us some about how your context of service has informed your content of ministry?
I think you have to keep your eyes on what's going on around you. I think the gospel intersects with life. And I think, somewhere I read, the gospel has to be related to where people are itching. And, if the church is scratching, but nobody is itching, there's nothing happening. And I think I think the gospel is relevant because the preacher, the pastor, is that human personality that speaks truth to a situation where they're living, where they're ministering. And I think the pastor always has to keep his or her eyes wide open and try to walk in somebody else's truth. And that's not always easy. And you'll certainly get some bumps in the road in terms of walking that walk, and also have to deal with your own fears. And I would say also for me, I tried to, even though I wanted to see what was going on in the local community, there's certain things that I automatically brought to ministry that I think pretty much applies everywhere. And for me, it was ministering to senior citizens, trying to have some kind of ministry that was relevant for senior citizens. I found out it really did not you didn't have to be a rocket scientist to minister to senior citizens. The main thing you would teach the Bible and love on people and try to, help them beyond their isolation. And that, offered a midday something related to when people can come out of the house and not be afraid, in terms of the context where they're living. That, I've tried to do, but I've only been in 2 different locations, pastors, but I've seen it work everywhere. Senior citizens and children.
You're in Hackensack, New Jersey, just outside of New York City. Can you think of something in your context, in your Bergen County context, that has informed your ministry particularly, where if you were maybe in a rural setting, it might be different, but can you think of something that is particular to your Bergen County, New Jersey setting that has informed your ministry?
We are suburban and a few miles from New York City, but we are small enough that you can know people in our context. You can go. There's four hospitals now. You can really go to every one of the hospitals and see people if you want to. There's a number of nursing homes. You can really go to those places every day of the week if you want to. So it gives you that kind of personal touch here. And then we're really a melting pot in terms of Hackensack, in terms of the Hackensack High School, just people from all over the world.
So, in that kind of context where you have all that stuff going on, can you talk about either particularly or generally about how the capacity of a pastor contributes to the content of ministry? We talked a little bit how the context is related to it, but can you talk a little bit about how a pastor's capacity contributes to the content of ministry?
Somewhere I read, if you want to measure the temperature of a church, put a thermometer in the pastor's mouth. And I think that there's some truth there somewhere. And capacity is so important in developing the ministry and offering leadership to the church. Early on in ministry, I think that I was a excellent administrator, but I wasn't necessarily a great leader. And it took a while to learn the difference. You can be a great administrator and just move chairs around on the Titanic, but you're going down. So your chairs will be lined as the ship sinks. Or you can learn some leadership skills to help to engage the church in the context of ministry. And I think you can learn both ways. You can learn obviously by reading. And I think that's one way that we learn. But you can also learn in association to other pastors, and not just other pastors, to other political leaders, to other leaders in your community, and it's certainly members in your congregation to learn. And I think that it's sort of like I've seen choir directors. You can have the same people in the choir and a different director, and oh, what a difference it makes. The same thing is true in ministry. You can have the same people in the congregation, but depending upon the capacity, and by capacity too, I don't mean just knowledge, even though that is really largely what I'm saying, but I'm talking about relationships and how you relate to your congregation and how you lead and how you use authority. And sometimes, we try to use authority before we get it. And that's takes a while to learn that too. Been there, done that too. So
we've been friends a quarter century and have traveled different parts of the world. Can you think of one or two lessons that you have learned from your experience with global Christianity that has helped you as a pastor?
one thing that I have learned, that people struggle pretty much with the same thing everywhere. Even in a so-called first world or third world, we wrestle with poverty. We wrestle with relational kind of issues. And for those of us who are Black, we wrestle with some form of racism or classism, those kinds of things, sexism, that's one thing that I've seen pretty much everywhere in the world. Another thing that I think that I've seen, the gospel is contextual, and it's difficult to take a gospel of Jesus Christ and preach it in Port Elizabeth, South Africa, like I might preach it in Hackensack, New Jersey. And that sounds a little strange, but it's the same thing in Hackensack, New Jersey. It's difficult for me to go to Holy Trinity Catholic Church, the largest Catholic church in Hackensack, and preach the same kind of sermon that I preach at Mount Olive. It won't work. I find that you have to exegete the congregation as well as the text. And one of the places that I learned that was in India. And I was preaching somewhere in India, and it was packed. I mean, the church was packed, people standing outside. And these persons believed in healing. And I was the preacher of the day. And after the sermon, everybody wanted me to lay hands on them. I mean, everybody. When I say everybody, I'm talking about hundreds of people. And it was nothing for a woman who might have been having breast cancer or something, wanted me to lay hands right on her breast. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm really freaking out, but for them, they were looking at healing. They really believed in healing. And I think they felt some kind of connection to so-called Western preaching, from the West, that somehow I had this extra power because I was from the United States of America, and they were not going to let me get out of there without laying hands on them, because they felt like it's sort of like the woman, the woman who had the issue of blood. This might be the last time that I have this possibility. So those kind of contextual things stay with you and help me to understand. You don't have all the truth. You learn as you go. Hopefully you grow, and it's a dangerous thing. It's one thing to carry the gospel with you when you go around the world, but it's another thing to think that you have all the answers.
A word to our listeners. Lott Carey's Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving podcast is funded by the Lilly Endowment through its Thriving in Ministry initiative. We'll be right back with more from the interview.
Since 1897, the Lott Carey Global Christian Missional Community has helped churches to extend the Christian witness around the world. We collaborate with indigenously led communities to bear good and faithful witness to Christ Jesus through ministries of evangelism, compassion, empowerment, and advocacy in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Europe, North America, Oceania, and South America. Together, we are touching lives with transforming love. You too can help to extend the Christian witness throughout the world. Visit us at lottcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. Thanks for praying for and investing in the good news globally through word and deed.
Welcome back to the Lott Carey podcast, Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving. I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Madison McQuarrie, the Learning Coordinator of Lott Carey's Thriving in Ministry program. Each week in this podcast, my colleague, Reverend Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, interviews a prominent Black pastoral leader to gain insight for flourishing in ministry. Now back to more of his interview with Reverend Gregory J. Jackson, Pastor Emeritus of the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Hackensack, New Jersey.
Talk to us a little about an area of leadership where you have had to develop as a pastor. Earlier, you talked about when you were younger, you were a strong administrator and you had to learn to be a better leader. Is there another area of leadership that you can think of where you've had to develop?
First of all, I think it's where you learn. And when you've grown up in a Baptist Black context early on, the church was just like, well, we will send you to Hampton and we will send you to the National Baptist Convention, and that was fine for then, but it was not necessarily what I was striving with at that time or what I wanted help in at that time. So thinking outside of your circle. It's not to say that you can't learn from Black settings, but it is to say that there's a whole lot of stuff that you can learn in all other kinds of settings as well that is more relevant to the problems that you may be having in ministry right now. Going to several conferences with John Maxwell really opened my eyes about leadership. Meeting you and spending time with other pastors who were, much further along in ministry than I was. I think, you mentioned that you can't just, drag somebody else's ministry into your context, but you can learn valuable lessons from other pastors by spending 2 weeks with them or whatever it is, listening to them, and it could be a seminary course in that. And so I learned so much on the road, if you will, from just conversations, the whole idea of iron sharpening iron. I don't know if I'm iron, but I know that I've been in the context and the presence of some iron guys, some strong, solid pastors, preachers, ministers, global missioners, and they blessed my life. So I would say preaching, I've developed and grown in terms of my preaching skills. But for me, that has been a dance between my social activism and my preaching. And it depends what's going on in the context of the world, that you can spend so much time out there doing that your preaching suffers. The same thing about my reading. You can read so much political stuff and what's going on in the world that you just have one sermon, and that's kind of a danger somewhere along the line, where you have what you're going to say and you just tag on a little scripture.
What brings you the most joy as a pastor?
I read this obituary in the New York Times yesterday of this principal down in Texas. She had died of the coronavirus, but she became known as the turnaround principal. That whenever the superintendent needed a school to turn around, school was failing in this and failing in that, he would call on her. And she would go over there, and according to this obituary, she'd create tutoring programs for the students. On one hand, she would do this tutoring program for the students. On the other hand, she would have continuing education for the teachers. And she was able to turn the schools around, but also to turn the lives around of children. I thought, wow, what a wonderful obituary to be known as a turnaround principal. And I thought, that's what I would like to be known for, as a turnaround pastor, to help people turn their lives around, to help young children believe in themselves, that they can accomplish some stuff. And a part of my own transparency and my own testimony of how my life was turned around by various people that I met, and that what God's done for me, he can do for anybody.
Do you recall something that you would call the best advice you received about pastoral leadership?
It probably came from my pastor early on, and that was, make sure you understand the difference between preaching and pastoring. Pastoring requires affirmation and loving people and forgiving people and walking with people through their joys and through their pain, crying with people, laughing with people. And then you preach, but you do the best you can, but don't think that in our pastoral excellence journey for some years ago, I remember starting that thinking like, what is pastoral excellence? Asking that question. I'm not sure that I completely know what pastoral excellence is now, but I know what it is not. It is far more than preaching. That I do know. So
I asked you about the best advice that you received about pastoral leadership. In this podcast of Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, we have pastors, aspiring pastors, or people in different kinds of ministry positions who are tuning in week by week across the country and around the world. What advice would you like to give to our listeners today about what they can do to flourish in ministry?
Read. And make it a priority. Read broad, read novels. Just don't read so-called Christian stuff. Travel. And I guess it depends on what you want to be and how you want to develop your own ministry. As I look at the persons that I think are the phenomenal preachers, every last one of them are, readers. The other thing I would say, even though I say read, figure out how to balance it, because I would think that you would want to be both. You would want that pastoral touch as well as that scholarly preacher, and you've got to figure out how to balance it. So it's that kind of dance that I think that we have to wrestle with in terms of flourishing and growing. But I also believe that I would say all growth begins, first of all, with you growing yourself. And if it's not all growth, a large part of the growth of the congregation, it begins with the pastor growing him or herself. And if you're not growing, chances are your church is not growing. I want to just tell you a lesson that I learned from the late Dr. Wendell C. Somerville by going to Lott Carey. I remember early on when I went to my first Lott Carey convention. I think it's probably like 85 or 86. I had just gotten to Mount Olive, and Mrs. Somerville came and she said to the congregation, "Y'all let that boy come and I will pay." So she did. So we went to Louisville, Kentucky. And I've heard Dr. Somerville say this several times, which I think is worth hearing. He said, you can take a little preacher and put him in a big church. Back then it was mostly all male, but it applies male or female. You can take a little preacher, little male, little female, put him in a big church, and he or she will whittle it down to their size, to their capacity in a short amount of time. Or you can take a big preacher, a preacher that is rooted, a preacher that is developing and growing and studying and reading and exposed. And you can put that preacher in a little church, and he or she will grow it to his or her size in a short order of time. I think that is so true. That's a lesson that I learned from Lott Carey.
We've been talking with Reverend Gregory J. Jackson, the pastor emeritus of the Mount Olive Baptist Church in Hackensack, New Jersey, and also the president of the Lott Carey Foreign Mission Society. Pastor Jackson, thanks for spending time with us and sharing in this conversation and offering your wisdom about striving and thriving in ministry.
Thank you, sir. Be blessed.
Thank you for joining us today for Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, a weekly podcast from Lott Carey as we listen in on conversations with prominent pastoral thought leaders. Join us next week for a conversation with a new guest and fresh insights. Wisdom from the Black Church for the whole church. I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Madison McQuarrie. Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving is produced in partnership with Good Faith Media. Music by Makita McQuarrie. Share the word with those who need to hear it. Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, wherever you get your podcasts.